Good evening. Well, that was lame. You guys always this bad? I'm going to speak to you tonight about how badly has the Bible been corrupted. And I want to begin by telling you a story about a young man by the name of Brother Andrew back in the 9th century. He was a monk studying at what was the equivalent of a theological seminary in his day. He was studying near the small coastal town of Pevensey in southern England. When he got done with his seminary training, as was the custom with these monks who went through their theological education, the equivalent of the president of the seminary wrote a letter of recommendation for him and sent him off and assigned him to go to a particular monastery. So he carried this letter, and of course it was sealed in wax by the president so that he could not see what was in the letter. And he came to this monastery. The abbot greeted him, and the abbot opened up the letter and read it silently in front of Brother Andrew. And he noticed that the president had said the following: Brother Andrew is a very detailed, conscientious individual. He's very solitary, does not have a sense of humor that we know of, and is, in fact, anal. At least that's what they said in the 9th century, the equivalent of that. And so the abbot looked at him and thought, I wonder what we should have him do. And he was concerned, frankly, about whether he should have him copy out the manuscripts, the legal documents of this monastery. That was the ideal task, but he just didn't know if he could be trusted to do that. And Brother Andrew at least had enough discernment to all of a sudden say, "Boiler up!" And the abbot decided this guy is trustworthy. And so I thought you'd like that. I've never said that before, by the way. And so he said, I have a job for you, Brother Andrew. I'm going to ask you to copy out the legal documents of the monastery. And here's the room. And he took him to the room where he decided he would do this work. And Brother Andrew began in earnest. And about an hour and a half later, he pounded on the abbot's door, and the abbot opened his door, and Brother Andrew said, Holy Father, I think there's some discrepancies in the manuscripts here, and I wanted to know if you have some older ones that I could copy. I'm a little bit concerned about what these might have to say. And so the abbot decided, okay, we do. I'll take you to another room that has older manuscripts that are a couple hundred years older than this. And so he took him to this other room, and Brother Andrew began to copy out the legal documents that basically ran how the monastery was supposed to be run. And so he began to copy out these documents. And about an hour later, he knocked on the abbot's door again. Holy Father, these manuscripts also have some discrepancies. Is it possible for me to look at much, much older manuscripts? And the abbot sized him up and decided, Brother Andrew, I've never done this on the first day at the monastery. In fact, I've never done it ever with any monk. I'm going to take you to see the original legal documents of this monastery. And so he walked down this labyrinthian subterranean path into the bowels of the library, and there was this archives room with these dusty old books that nobody had seen in hundreds of years. And he set Brother Andrew to copying these out. About 45 minutes later, there were about 15 different sets of hands pounding on the abbot's door. And the abbot opened the door, and it was all the rest of the monks in the monastery. And they said, Holy Father, this new monk has gone berserk. You need to go see what's going on. And so they scurried down this labyrinthian path and got down to see where Brother Andrew was, and he was weeping. He was pounding his fist on his table. And he said, they left out the letter R. They left out the letter R. And the abbot thought, man, this fellow really is anal. And then Brother Andrew said, the word is supposed to be celebrate. Now, some people up here got this first. Then it kind of took a serpentine path like that. Are you all from Ohio over there by any chance? Well, That, in a nutshell, is textual criticism, my area of specialty. Dealing with manuscripts, trying to ascertain what the original wording is, and in most cases, they're not quite as consequential as that. So I want to talk to you about, has the Bible been corrupted, or how badly has the Bible been corrupted? Because for one thing, the Bible has been corrupted. And I will be specifically dealing with just New Testament manuscripts, since that's my area of expertise. I want to begin by quoting from some people who think it has been terribly corrupted. And we begin with that great scholar, Dan Brown, in his book, The Da Vinci Code, where he says, the Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. Now, you all have heard something like that, and most of you have probably said something like that. When you work at the office or go to the gym or go get your latte at the local Starbucks, you may say, hasn't the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times we can't possibly get back to the original? And that's an attitude that many people have. We'll address that tonight to see if that's the case. Well, Dan Brown is just a novelist. Let's kick this up a notch to C.J. Werleman. He's an atheist who has written some provocatively titled books, like Jesus Lied, He Was Only Human. He's got Jesus here linked up to a lie detector test device. And his first book, this is an atheist, understand. His first book was called God Hates You, Hate Him Back. That's a provocative title, especially for an atheist. Maybe the title should have been Nothing Hates You, Hate Nothing Back. But that probably wouldn't sell books as well either. So in this book, Werleman says, we do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. He's absolutely correct about that. What we have are copies of copies. Again, correct. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. I have no idea where he got that from. Well, that's a novelist and an atheist. And Muslims are also joining the chorus. M.M. al-Azami is a British Muslim who is a very popular writer, and he has written a book called The History of the Quranic Text from Revelation to Compilation, a comparative study with the Old and New Testaments. And in this book, he makes a very damning statement about Christianity and the New Testament. The Orthodox Church, he says, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God, but a man; Docetism, the opposite view that he was God and not man; and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the Scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. In other words, what al-Azami seems to be saying is that the original New Testament had a variety of viewpoints about Jesus, especially adoptionism, Docetism, separationism. But the idea that the early church, the so-called Orthodox sect that won by might, destroyed the other manuscripts so that they could present a different view of Christ that spoke of him as being God in the flesh, that was a later development. Well, Dan Brown is not a biblical scholar, C.J. Werleman is not a biblical scholar, and M.M. al-Azami is not a biblical scholar. Where do these people get these ideas from? They do get it from biblical scholars, legitimate biblical scholars, and in particular, as Corey Miller pointed out, Bart Ehrman is a primary source for an awful lot of this. He is a very well-known scholar. He's someone who went through Moody Bible Institute as an evangelical Christian, graduated from Wheaton College, another evangelical institute in Illinois as well. And then he went on to Princeton Seminary to get his Master of Divinity under the renowned New Testament scholar Dr. Bruce Metzger, and he got his PhD from Metzger as well, both in the realm of textual criticism. So Bart Ehrman knows what he's talking about when he talks about New Testament manuscripts. He is a very well-respected textual critic, and in fact is a longtime friend of mine. We've known each other for almost 34 years. He wrote a book in 2005 called Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. Now, on the cover of this book, it's very interesting. It's got a medieval scribe, and then it's got some text that is undecipherable, and that's because it's in Hebrew that is upside down. The New Testament was written in Greek, and it wasn't written upside down either, as far as I know. I don't think Bart had anything to do with the choice of this cover. He actually wanted to call the book Lost in Transmission, but his publishers nixed that. They said it's going to get lost in the automotive section at Barnes & Noble, so we don't want to have it do that. So they ended up with Misquoting Jesus. This is the first popular book that basically distills what textual scholars have wrestled with for many, many years and lays it out in a way that is understandable to the masses. Published in 2005, within a couple of months, Ehrman ended up on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. And Stewart interviewed him and said to him, "This is a great book." In fact, he said, "This is one hell of a book. I congratulate you, sir." That's an unusual adjective to use for a book about Jesus, isn't it? But nevertheless, that's what happened. 2 days later, Misquoting Jesus became the #1 bestseller on Amazon. Within the first 3 months, over 100,000 copies were sold, and this was Bart Ehrman's, if I'm not mistaken, his first New York Times bestseller. He's had several since. Well, here's what he says in Misquoting Jesus. Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. This is where C.J. Werleman got his idea of 20 generations removed of copies, which I know no one who says that, except C.J. Werleman. But this is where what his source is. And M.M. Al-Azami is linking to another text that Ehrman speaks about towards the end of the book, where Ehrman says, "The more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them." M.M. Al-Azami is saying the early so-called Orthodox Church changed the text to reflect a so-called Orthodox vision of Christ in which he is affirmed as the God-man, and that was something that was added later. He gets his basic ideas from this book, Bart Ehrman's book. Now, as we begin to wrestle with these issues, there's two attitudes that I want all of us to try to avoid. And I'm speaking to both those of you who are skeptics or non-Christians and those who are Christians. On the one hand, I think we need to avoid the attitude of radical skepticism, the attitude that says we can't possibly get back to the original text in any way. There's no way in which we can recover it. We might as well just give up because we have no idea what the original manuscripts actually said. I will try to demonstrate tonight that that is a rather irrational viewpoint that would put us back in the Dark Ages if we were to adopt it across the board for Greco-Roman literature. Then there's the other attitude, and that's the attitude of absolute certainty. Now, I have heard people in Ohio and Texas and West Virginia who have an absolute certainty about what the original Bible said. And they have said this in all seriousness. If the King James Bible was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. When I hear that in Texas, then immediately my mind has to go elsewhere, and I decide to pitch the conversation at a level that both of us can understand. And so I say, well, how about them Cowboys? And it's as far as we can go with that subject. But those of you who are Christians, who go to church and have a Bible and read your Bible, and it's a different translation from the King James, which is now over 400 years old, you too may hold to some kind of an absolute certainty. You may think that the book you hold in your hands is in every single respect the Word of God. It isn't. Those changes that have been made in the translations over time are constantly evolving. Even the King James Bible made 100,000 changes between its first publication in 1611 and the latest one of 1769 when it went through its third edition. But modern translations do this too. If you use, say, the NIV, which NIV do you use, the 1984 edition or the 2011? There are textual changes, different texts that have been translated that scholars have said, we believe this now is the original wording, when in 1984 we believe that wording over there was original. There's translational philosophical differences and interpretive differences because all translation is interpretation. And so they make changes to these texts. We cannot be absolutely certain, and I'm speaking to those of you who are Christians, we cannot be absolutely certain that the Bible we hold in our hands is in every respect exactly what the apostles and the associates originally wrote. We can't be. I'll give you some examples tonight about that. So these are the two attitudes that we need to avoid. Where do we end up then? Well, somewhere in the middle, but not exactly in the middle. There's 4 questions I want us to answer. The first is, how many textual variants are there? And we will spend the bulk of our time on this one question. Bart Ehrman said there's 200,000, 300,000, maybe 400,000. We'll discuss that to see how many there are, at least as far as the best estimates are concerned. And we'll define what a textual variant is. Then we'll ask what kinds of textual variations are there. So the first is the number of variants. The second is the nature of variants. Do they affect things like the deity of Christ? Do they affect the virgin birth of Christ? What about the resurrection of Christ? Are there manuscripts that say Jesus was not raised from the dead? If that's the case, then we may have a bit of a problem believing in that. That is, those of us who are Christians. And so we want to wrestle with the nature of these variants. And then we're going to go deeper on that same subject. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? It would be nice to know if things like the virgin birth and the deity of Christ and his resurrection are beliefs that are taught, that are secure in the manuscripts. It would be perhaps painful if we came across manuscripts that said, no, there's some doubt about whether Jesus was born of a virgin. There certainly is doubt about that outside the New Testament, but the New Testament is what I'm speaking about right now. And finally, we'll ask the question, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? Now, historically, when I lecture, I tend to speak for about 2 or 3 hours on the preface, and then I get into the actual lecture. It's about 5 minutes long. So just park your butts in your chair, enjoy the ride. All right. Let me begin with another prefatory issue. The preliminary question, don't we have the original New Testament anymore? No, we don't. All of these manuscripts, each of them written to individuals or to churches, would have turned to dust by the end of the 2nd century. They were written on papyrus, a fragile material that is roughly the consistency of our modern paper, and that's very rough. But it's made out of the papyrus reeds stamped together, and they didn't last that long, especially if a manuscript was read and reread and copied and recopied and recopied. We do have examples of a number of papyri that lasted for hundreds of years. And in fact, we have several New Testament papyri, copies of the original, that still exist today. But we don't have the original manuscripts anymore. Well, if we don't have the originals, what about the copies? What if they all agree with each other? Well, then we wouldn't be able to do textual criticism. We just have to say that's probably the original or is as close as we can get. But they don't agree with each other. In fact, there are no 2 manuscripts that agree completely. The 2 closest manuscripts in terms of their verbal relationship to each other from the first 8 centuries have between 6 and 10 differences per chapter. Those manuscripts are known as P75 and B, or Codex Vaticanus. And those 2 manuscripts have a very high agreement, and yet they're the 2 most closely related manuscripts of the first 8 centuries. Between 6 and 10 variants per chapter, you extrapolate that out of the whole New Testament, that would be about 2,000 variants for the 2 most closely related early manuscripts. So because of the disappearance of the originals, and because of the disagreements among the manuscripts, we have to do what's called textual criticism to try to get back to the original wording. Another preliminary question, and this is the last one, is what is a textual variant? A textual variant is any place among the manuscripts in which there is variation in wording. This includes word order, which is not nearly as significant in Greek as it is in English, omission or addition of words. Even spelling differences count as textual variants. And I should state here briefly that there is a view that has circulated among evangelical Christians for over 50 years that textual variants are counted by what the difference in the wording is by times the number of manuscripts that have those differences. That's not how textual variants are counted. And so if you had, on that accounting, if you have, say, 400 places where you have 1,000 manuscripts in each one of those places that disagree with the base text, this method of counting the variants would say there's 400,000 variants. In reality, there are 400 variants, each of which is attested by 1,000 manuscripts. It doesn't matter if you have one manuscript or 1,000,000 manuscripts that attest to something, that still is one variant. It just has to do with the number of manuscripts that attest it. So that's not how biblical scholars count these variants. All right, so the number of variants. Hope you appreciate this chart. I did this myself. Very professionally done, you can see. Rich blue. Well, I won't go on and on. It's not becoming to brag about myself. But the Greek New Testament has approximately 140,000 words in it. Or to be more precise, 138,162. Now, don't ask me how I know that, but I am related to Brother Andrew. In terms of textual variants, the best estimates are that there are about 400,000 textual variants among the New Testament manuscripts. At least that was the best estimate up until a little more than a year ago, when a former student of mine, who went on to Cambridge University to get his PhD in New Testament textual studies, gave a lecture at a scholarly society meeting, and this was later published in a major journal just last month, where he estimated, did a very careful job of this, that there are approximately 500,000 textual variants among the manuscripts. Well, that's a lot of variants for a text with only about 140,000 words. And for those of you who are skeptical, you're thinking, this is really good news. That's exactly what I expected. Those of you who are Christians are looking for the exit. Well, let's look at the rest of the story, shall we? The reason that we have a lot of textual variants is that we have a lot of manuscripts. If we had one manuscript, it would not disagree with itself. It would just be one manuscript. But if we had two manuscripts, as soon as you add a second one, you're going to have differences. And those differences don't mean you can't get back to the original wording. As a matter of fact, if both of those manuscripts are from, say, the same time period, the same century, we have an internal way of examining these manuscripts to see if one of the other is actually closer in the wording to the original document. You start multiplying manuscripts, you start getting earlier manuscripts, and we find a whole lot more manuscripts that help us to get back to the original wording. I want to go back 300 years to John Mill's Novum Testamentum Graeca. In 1707, this Cambridge scholar published this volume that was it was his life's work. It was 30 years of work where he looked at 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts, early patristic quotations of the New Testament, early versions, that is, early translations, and he put together this massive volume that has an apparatus or footnotes that lists all the variants that he could find. And let me just show you a page from the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse in this book. You notice the yellow line that tells you the text that's above the apparatus, then the footnotes that tell you the variants. I chose this page because the book of Revelation has fewer manuscripts for it than any other book of the New Testament, and consequently it will not have as many variants. That's a lot of variants on every single page that we have in John Mill's work. Now, John Mill was immediately attacked when he published this volume. There were conservative Protestants who said, this is the work of the devil. You're looking at these things, you're discovering variants from our precious, what's called the Textus Receptus, And they said, you've changed the text. Frankly, as a Christian, I would have to say serious historical research is never the work of the devil. That's what Christians should be about. We should always be in the business of pursuing truth no matter the cost. So John Mill was criticized by conservative Protestants. He was criticized by Roman Catholics who said, you Protestants have a paper pope, but he disagrees with himself. He's got footnotes, and we're not sure which is ex cathedra, the text or the apparatus. Remarkably, John Mill did not defend himself against any of his attackers. Not one word. And that's because he died exactly 2 weeks after this volume was published. Now, I want to go the same way he did. When I do my magnum opus, I want to die 2 weeks later so I don't need to deal with all those critics. But I'm not timing it that way. I'm actually kind of delaying that book, so it's way down the line. John Mill didn't defend it, but there was a fellow who did defend his work. His name was Richard Bentley, and he is universally regarded as a textual scholar light years ahead of his time. In his book, Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking, published 6 years after Mill's book came out, he said, if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, let me just stop there and say he's talking about the publication of the first Greek New Testament, that is Erasmus's Greek New Testament, done in 1516. We're celebrating the 500th anniversary of Erasmus's Greek New Testament this year. And Erasmus based it on 7 manuscripts. But Bentley said, if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, then we would have had no various readings at all. And would the text be in a better condition then than it is now that we have 30,000 variant readings? It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security, sorry. So Bentley is arguing that what John Mill did was actually helping us to get back to the wording of the original that much more. 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts, several versions, several church fathers, and he found 30,000 variants. What we're facing today is what some have dubbed an embarrassment of riches, because we have far more than 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and we have thousands upon thousands of versions. Here's what the basic statistics are. Greek New Testament manuscripts come in at about 5,839. That's the official number, published in Münster, Germany, where they are the official catalogers of these Greek New Testament manuscripts. And although most of these are not complete New Testaments, only 61 of them have the entire New Testament in them, most of them are far more than small scraps. The average sized Greek New Testament manuscript is more than 450 pages long. 5,839 of them. But I'm going to give you something that updates this. As of last month, it's now 5,856. And that's because of the work that my institute, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, has been doing this last year. I made 7 trips to Athens in 2015 and examined well over 100,000 pages of these manuscripts, handwritten Greek manuscripts, medieval and ancient manuscripts, so that we could have digitizing teams come in with state-of-the-art equipment and begin to photograph them. 150,000 pages of manuscripts altogether is what we will be digitizing at the National Library of Greece. And in this last year, we've discovered 17 more New Testament manuscripts. Now, Münster, the institute that catalogs these manuscripts, is not aware of these other 17 yet. So tomorrow, let's say you're at Starbucks and you're enjoying your grande black eye, which is my drink of choice. It's 2 shots of espresso and a regular cup of coffee. 3 shots of espresso and a regular cup of coffee is called a train wreck. I don't typically go that far. But so you're in Starbucks, you're enjoying a grande black eye. And somebody comes up to you and says, you know, I've been thinking about the New Testament text. I'm sure this happens all the time. And it's a friend of yours who happens to be a skeptic. And the skeptic says, I know that there's 5,839 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. That would be impressive. But then you want to correct them and say, actually, you're wrong. There's 5,856. So now you have the latest data. In case somebody comes up and says that to you, you'll know what the actual numbers are. That's a lot of manuscripts. It's more than 2.6 million pages of text for us to digitize. And CSNTM's initial goal is to digitize all Greek New Testament manuscripts. We've done about 13% so far, which is great job security for me. Now, the New Testament was early on translated into a variety of languages. Late 2nd century, we have the New Testament begin to be translated into Latin. And Latin swept across Western Europe, so it became the lingua franca of Western Europe, beginning in the 4th century, and Greek started to have a shrinking influence. So we have nearly twice as many Latin manuscripts of the New Testament as we do of Greek. But it was translated into other languages early on as well, like Coptic, Syriac, Old Church Slavonic, Georgian, Gothic, Armenian, Aramaic, Arabic, even Hebrew. And the best estimates are that there are somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 copies of the New Testament, handwritten manuscript copies before the time of the printing press in these other languages. Now altogether you add that up and we're looking at 20 to 25,000 manuscripts. That's a lot of manuscripts of the New Testament. But what if we had a magic wand and we could just destroy all of those in one fell swoop? We would still not be left without a witness. And that's because of patristic writers, or what's sometimes known as church fathers. They wrote commentaries on the New Testament, and they quoted from the New Testament. They wrote theological treatises and homilies and sermons and all sorts of documents. And when they quoted from the New Testament and commented on it, they did not have the gift of brevity. They were rather verbose, and they commented and quoted and quoted and quoted. In Boiron, Germany, in the last several years, they've been, for the last almost 100 years actually, they've been cataloging these patristic quotations of the New Testament. And a few decades ago, the number of quotations of the New Testament by these church fathers came up to over 1 million. Now, the Greek New Testament originally has somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7,941 verses. To have over 1 million quotations, that means more than likely a number of these verses are quoted several times over. If you did not have any of these other witnesses, we could reconstruct virtually the entire New Testament many, many times over on the basis of these quotations by the church fathers alone. And that's something that even Bart Ehrman has said. Now, let's compare this to the average classical work, the ancient Greco-Roman writings, and let me compare it especially to the average classical Greek writer. The average classical Greek author has less than 15 copies of his works still in existence. I was just reading today about Xenophon's Hellenica, and one of the major texts on it said, we have quite a few copies of Xenophon's Hellenica. We have 20 copies. 20 copies, compared to 20,000 to 25,000 for the New Testament. If you were to stack those up, they'd be about 4 feet high. So let's do a comparison, a direct comparison between the New Testament stack and the average classical work. The average classical work would be about the size of this podium right here, about 4 feet tall. The New Testament, what would we use for that? Well, the Empire State Building, I think, is a good measure of comparison, but I hope you realize this is not to scale. So I'm going to show it to you to scale now. And watch this very carefully. Watch the end of the arrow there. You see that dot? It's 1 pixel on my screen. That's the podium to scale. It's 4 feet tall. That's the Empire State Building, 1,454 feet tall. Now that's an appropriate ratio between the two, but it's not an appropriate ratio between the average classical Greek author's extant writings and the New Testament manuscripts. We have to have more than 1 Empire State Building. We have to have 2, or 3, or 4. Actually, we have to have 4.5 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of one another, and it comes to 1.25 miles high. Now, I'm counting just manuscripts, I have no idea how to quantify these quotations by the church fathers. Just the Greek and other ancient language manuscripts, we're talking about 1.25 miles high versus 4 feet tall. We face an embarrassment of riches that classical scholars would love to have for their texts. Now, that gives you a sense of the numbers, but let's think about the dates of these copies. When you look at some very well-known Greco-Roman historians and biographers, Pliny the Elder, a first-century writer, we're waiting 700 years before we get a single copy of his writings. And so we have quite a few of them, actually. We have 200 copies of Pliny, but we're waiting 700 years before we get any. Plutarch's Lives, very famous classical Greek author, he wrote about the biographies of many people. We're waiting 800 years before we get any copies. Josephus, his book of Antiquities of the Jews, he's a first-century author as well, 800 years before we get any copies. The reason we have more copies of Antiquities, we have about 20 of them, than we have of some of his other writings, is because he talks about this fellow named John the Baptist. We read about him in the New Testament. And this guy named James, who is the brother of this man named Jesus Christ. And he talks about Jesus Christ as well. So in Antiquities, Book 18, that is the most copied of his books because it refers to individuals that are mentioned in the New Testament, and it was the Christian scribes who copied out the Antiquities. That's why we have this many of them. Polybius, 1,200 years before we get a single shred of any evidence from Polybius. And Pausanias, who wrote the geography of Greece, 1,400 years before we see any manuscripts. Not only 1,400 years, but there's several huge gaps in his writings. Now, Herodotus, who's been called the father of history, in his book, Histories, we are waiting 1,500 years before we get manuscripts of any substantial size. We do have a number of early papyri that go spread out over the centuries, but we're waiting 1,500 years. He's 5th century BC before we get anything of substantial size of Herodotus. And Xenophon's Hellenica, he's from the 4th century BC, 1,800 years before we get anything that is of substantial size, apart from just a few small fragments of papyri of the Hellenica. Now, what if the New Testament were in this kind of a shape? That would be like saying our earliest substantial manuscripts of the New Testament were written about the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. If that were the case, then I think you skeptics would have an argument. But I think I know that's not the case. And yet, again, I was reading just today about Xenophon's Hellenica, and the author said, the text has been fairly stable, and most scholars believe that we can recover the original wording, at least in most respects, because of these manuscripts, all 20 of them they have. Now, let me talk to you just for a moment about the date of New Testament manuscripts. I've talked to you about the number of New Testament manuscripts. I've talked to you about the number of different classical authors and the date of those. Now it's time to talk to you about the date of New Testament manuscripts. And I want to talk to you about the oldest published Greek New Testament manuscript, which is P52. For those of you who are of the older generation, this is not a follow-up prototyped P51 Mustang that fought in World War II. This stands for papyrus number 52. Here's a picture of it, which is not exactly the size. It's a little bit smaller than that. It's about the size of a credit card. Let me give you the backstory of this. In the year 1844, the great scholar Ferdinand Christian Bauer, F.C. Bauer, at the University of Tübingen in southern Germany, wrote an article in the Tübinger Jahrbuch, or the Tübingen yearbook or journal, if you will. And what Bauer wrote in there was he essentially took principles that he had learned from his philosopher professor, Hegel. He applied Hegelian dialectic to the New Testament. Now, that's a fancy term to hear on a Friday night, and you might almost want to rebel and walk out when you hear that. But let me give you it in simpler terms. Hegelian dialectic is, and you've heard it this way, I'm sure, thesis, antithesis, and what's the third leg? One of you knows. That's good. Synthesis. A bright crowd here. Maybe all of you are from Ohio. I don't know. But anyway, speak up if you know the answer. It's all right. So Bauer applied Hegelian dialectic to the New Testament manuscripts, and he came to the conclusion through this philosophical construct that the Gospel of John could not have been written any earlier than AD 160. And he said, in fact, most likely it was written about AD 170. That view held sway for much of European scholarship for the next 90 years, until 1934, when a young man who had just recently earned his PhD was studying at Manchester University in central England, and he had inherited a shoebox full of papyrus scraps that had been excavated from Egypt in 1920, where his predecessor had not had the chance to go through all these papyri. And as he was looking through the papyri, he noticed that one of these was this scrap that is now called P52, and one of the most remarkable things he noticed about it was that it was written on both sides. Now, this young man, C.H. Roberts, would later go on to write the book called The Birth of the Codex, about 40 years after this. But the Codex is a book form that he would later tell us was not invented by Christians, but it was popularized by them. Virtually every book until the late first century was written on a scroll. But the Codex book form is one, I need to describe this carefully, so see if you can visualize this. It's bound on one side, and then it's got a cover on the front and back, and then it's got cut pages that you can turn and flip, and it's got page numbers. Most of you, if you're under the age of 30, have never seen a Codex because you use your iPads and your computers, and what you do, the way you look at a book, is you scroll. So you've gone retro on us, I'm afraid. For the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, 80% of all Christian books were written on a codex. 20% of all non-Christian books were written on a codex. For the first and probably only time in the history of the church, Christians were ahead of the technological curve. Now, this manuscript, C.H. Roberts took some good photographs of, and he sent these photographs out to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one of them, independently of the other, wrote back to him and said, this manuscript should not be dated any later than AD 150. And they all agreed it should be dated closer to AD 100. A fourth, a German scholar, demurred, and he said, I think it may have been written in the 90s. Now, I don't know about you. I grew up in Surftown, USA, Newport Beach, California. The surf in Dallas sucks, by the way. And I got a pretty decent education there. One of the things we were taught was that, generally speaking, the copy of a manuscript is not written before the original of that manuscript. That's kind of what you're taught here, too, isn't it, at Purdue? I hope so. And so what this did, this small scrap of papyrus, it sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. And it reminds me of this little ditty that is really helpful to know, that an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. There is a great deal of evidence that we have for the Christian faith, and when it comes to the manuscripts, it's far more than an ounce. Well, let me compare these manuscripts in another way, and that is by date and number. And the first few centuries are my own numbers, where this is the maximum number of manuscripts we have for each century. But in the 2nd century, we have as many as 12 New Testament manuscripts written before the year 200. And then by the 3rd, 61, on and on until the time we get to the 10th century, 967. And that's numbers that I've gotten from Munster and their dating of these manuscripts. 967, almost 1,000 manuscripts written within 900 years of the completion of the New Testament. Now, when it comes to comparing this to classical texts, there are 4 times more New Testament manuscripts within the first 200 years than the average Greco-Roman author has in 2,000 years. And within 900 years of the New Testament's completion, almost 1,000 manuscripts in Greek alone exist today. Within 900 years of the average classical author's writings, there are 0 manuscripts. So on the one hand, we have an embarrassment of riches for the New Testament. On the other hand, we have a dearth of evidence for almost the rest of Greco-Roman literature. So my first question was dealing with the number of variants, and we moved into the number of manuscripts, and this brings us to the sum of that first question. The rest of what I have to say will wrap up pretty quickly. This really does take most of my time. Has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? Well, another way to look at this is to compare it to the King James Bible. The Greek New Testament that essentially and originally stood behind the King James New Testament, which was Erasmus's Greek text of 1516, based on 7 manuscripts, the earliest of which went back to the 11th century, one he didn't use very much. Today, 400 years later, we have nearly 1,000 times as many Greek manuscripts, and some of them go back nearly 1,000 years older. So the bottom line is that as time goes on, we're actually getting closer and closer to the original text, not farther and farther away. Now, question 2. What kinds of textual variations are there? Well, there's 4 groups of textual variants, and I'm not going to go through all textual variants. You'd get quite bored if I spent the rest of the evening going through 500,000 textual variants. Most of them you wouldn't understand, and it would be an interesting exercise. I won't do that, though, here. All variants can be grouped in terms of whether they are meaningful or viable. Meaningful means they change the meaning of the text to some degree. Viable, they have a sufficient pedigree to potentially represent the wording of the original. That is, it comes in early enough manuscripts, or perhaps a cluster of manuscripts that can go back to a very early date, but not just one late 14th century medieval manuscript. These 4 kinds of variants then can be grouped into neither meaningful nor viable, viable but not meaningful. That is, it could be very early, very likely reading, but it just doesn't change any meaning at all. Meaningful but not viable, a late variant that can't possibly go back to the original. It's meaningful, but it's not viable. And then there's the last group, meaningful and viable. Now, rather than go through all 4 of these groups, let me just summarize the first 3 categories. Over 99% of all textual variants make virtually no difference at all. For example, differences in spelling is really the most common textual variant we have. Sorry about that. I'm glad you caught that. My faith in you is now restored. Except for that guy back there. But anyway, this is by far the most common textual variant we have in the New Testament manuscripts. As a matter of fact, the most common spelling difference is what's called a movable new. That's when you have N at the end of the word, and the next word starts with a vowel. And in the oldest manuscripts, that new didn't go anyplace. It just was there. In later manuscripts, they started to put it there when the next word started with a vowel. They took it off if it started with a consonant. So it's kind of like when we say a book, an apple, or at Ohio State, a book, a apple. You know, we know that's how they speak there, but you understand what they're talking about. So I asked myself 2 years ago, how many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? This is a great Greek geek question. I don't know if there's any Greek geeks here, but it's what preoccupies those of us who have nothing better to do with our time. And here's some of the items to consider. Word order differences. In Greek, word order is very flexible, and you can put those words in any arrangement you want. You can have John loves Mary, Mary loves John, John Mary loves, Mary John loves, anything like that. Loves John Mary. And every single time it means John loves Mary if the endings are what they're supposed to be. Greek word order, the translation of Greek, is determined by the inflected endings, not by word order. So word order differences account for quite a bit of it. Then there's the Greek article with proper names, sometimes called the definite article. In Greek, you can say, the John loves the Mary. The Mary loves the John. In English, we don't use that. In fact, in most translations, they don't add the article for that. Now, I did my master's thesis on when the Greek article does not occur in the New Testament. I did my doctoral dissertation on when it does occur. There's 20,000 of these little buggers in the Greek New Testament. 1 out of 7 words is the word the in the New Testament. So when I teach first-year Greek, and we have full professors at Dallas Seminary who teach first-year Greek, after our first week, and they learn the article, I say, congratulations, you now know 1/7 of the New Testament vocabulary. And they say, that's not really going to help me very much. The. Still can't translate. Now, my 2 works, both of which have been published, by the way, I just wanted you to know that in case you wanted to read them, would cure the most hopeless insomniac. My wife has never read them. And I still don't know why the article is used with proper names. There's a bunch of theories out there, but we're just not sure what it is. So you've got those kinds of differences. Then you've got differences in spelling. The name for John in Greek is either Ioannes or Ioannes. Pronounced the same, but it's either got two N's in the middle or not. Okay, here's the 8 ways you can say John loves Mary in Greek. I had to write this in Greek, otherwise if I wrote it in English, it would simply say John loves Mary, like that. And this will show up on the test, so I expect you all to be taking notes right now. These are the 8 ways to say John loves Mary. Oh, there's another 8 ways. And another 8. And a few more. 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. Every single time it's translated John loves Mary, every single time it means exactly the same thing. Now, if you have conjunctions that are often untranslated, there's a few more ways to say John loves Mary in Greek as well. Wish I could put this on autopilot because I need to get a drink here. 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. Every single time it's translated the same. Every single time it means exactly the same thing. If we use a different word for loves, then the numbers swell to over 1,000 times. And by the way, those 384 are not all the ways to say John loves Mary using the same word for loves each time. That's as many as I could come up with in 8 hours. So I hope you appreciate the work I invested in those slides that we just zipped right through because nobody wants to take any notes. So you could have over 1,000 ways to express in Greek the translation, John loves Mary. Bart Ehrman says in Misquoting Jesus, we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the texts of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. He's absolutely right about that. But if we were to discuss those, you would fall asleep faster than reading my doctoral dissertation. If we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without substantially changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless. What really counts is the nature of these variants. In fact, you could conceivably have tens of millions of textual variants for the New Testament without changing the meaning of any verse, any place. So 500,000 variants is a drop in the bucket of what it could be. And as I said, the vast majority of them affect nothing. The smallest group of variants, though, are those that are both meaningful and viable. That is, they have a good chance of being authentic. And that's less than 1/5 of 1% of all of the textual variants that we know about. So it's here's to scale what it would look like. That little yellow square in that big blue box is how many variants of the total really are both meaningful and viable. I'm going to give you 4 illustrations. These are all meaningful and viable textual variants. The first one comes from Mark chapter 9, verse 29, where after Jesus' disciples tried to cast out some demons, they were unsuccessful. And they came to him and said, Lord, why can't we cast this demon out? And he said to them, this kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. Notice, and fasting is in brackets here. That's because it's not found in all the manuscripts. It's not found in the earliest and what are typically considered to be the best manuscripts. The later manuscripts have it. Now, most scholars look at this and they say, you know, sifting through all the evidence, we think that we should put a period at the end of prayer. And so what Jesus is telling his disciples is that this kind can only be cast out by prayer, period. And I'm embarrassed to say, just by looking at me, you can see that I agree with the shorter reading. But I'm working on it. I've lost actually 50 pounds in the last 14 months. Come and talk to me about my diet afterwards. Anyway. Nevertheless, if you're involved in exorcisms, you might want to hedge your bet and fast as well as pray. You know, it's just a safe thing to do. Now, Revelation 13:18 is probably a text that's a little bit more familiar to you, at least one of the words here. And that is where it says, let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Is that really the number of the beast? In 1841, a fellow by the name of Constantin Tischendorf left Germany and went to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the National Library of France. And he examined a manuscript that had never been completely deciphered. In fact, most of it had not been deciphered before he came along. A decade earlier, the French authorities had given this actual manuscript a chemical bath, and it brought up the undertext of what was there. Now, I should explain that. Undertext, what I mean is this manuscript had been scraped over again centuries after it was originally written on. About 800 years later, a scribe scraped off the underlying Greek text and wrote some other material on top of it. That underlying text was from the 5th century, from the 400s. And Tischendorf took 2 years to decipher those 150 leaves of Greek manuscript. 2 years to decipher this. Painstakingly going through one letter at a time to see if you can reconstruct that underlying text. I had the privilege in 2009 of visiting the Bibliothèque Nationale and seeing this actual manuscript in the flesh. And it surprised me. I'm sure it surprised Tischendorf much more when he saw at Revelation 13 the number of the beast was 616, not 666. But that was the only manuscript we knew of that had that for the number of the beast. Until 1998, when at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, they published 17 papyri, New Testament papyri, and I think the most significant of these that they had in their collection was one that was 26 small fragments, some of which were the size of a postage stamp, spread out over 9 chapters of Revelation. This manuscript is the oldest manuscript for Revelation chapter 13. And it has, at Revelation 13:18, the number of the beast as 616. In 2002, 4 years after it was published, I had the privilege of going to the Ashmolean Museum and looking at this manuscript in the flesh as well. This fragment was between 2 plates of glass, which is always the best way to preserve papyri. And what was interesting about it was that there was a sheet of paper behind the front of this text. Now, it was written on both sides, but you couldn't read the backside because of the sheet of paper that was covering it. And it just so happened the backside is what had Revelation 13:18 on it. And I was curious about that. This was the most significant textual variant in this entire manuscript. And I asked the curator, I said, how many people have looked at this manuscript since it came out, since it was published 4 years ago? And he said, including you? Yes, 1. So apparently they had no need to slice it open so people could see it. I looked at it under a magnifying glass. I looked at it under a microscope, and sure enough, it said 616. Now, to this day, most scholars, as they've wrestled with this, they're not sure which wording is original, but still most scholars would say, 666, I'm fairly convinced that that's the number of the beast. 616, that's the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down. How'd you like to live in that neighborhood? I know of no Bible college, no theological seminary or theological institute or denomination or church that states as its doctrinal statement, we believe in the virgin birth, we believe in the deity of Christ. Of course, they'll have those statements. We believe in the resurrection of Christ, and we believe that the number of the beast is 666. It's meaningful. This is an important variant, 666 versus 616, but it's not that meaningful. It doesn't rise to the level of changing any essential beliefs of Christians. And yet this is one of the more significant textual variants among our New Testament manuscripts. Let me quickly address the 2 longest disputed passages in the New Testament. They are far longer than anything else we have. They are both 12 verses long, Mark 16, 9 through 20, John 7, 53 through 8, 11. We have 2 passages that are 12 verses long that are disputed. The next longest disputed passage is only 2 verses long. And we have maybe 2 or 3 dozen places that are 1 or 2 verses. Then after that, it gets significantly smaller down to the individual letters. I'm going to make this very brief, but Mark 16, 9 through 20 there's actually 5 different endings to the Gospel of Mark, and so a question here is which one, if any, concluded the Gospel, and for the sake of time, we're only going to focus on the 2 major endings. Some manuscripts, the earliest ones, end this at 16:8, known as the short ending, or the SE. Then they, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, went out and ran from the tomb, for terror and bewilderment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Period. End of story. The angel had just spoken to them and said, "Go and tell Jesus' disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. He's been raised from the dead." And they don't do this. Jesus' resurrection occurs before Mark 16:8, but there's no appearances by the resurrected Jesus to any of the disciples. And so a number of scribes added endings to this gospel, and by far the most common one is one that ends at 16:20. We're going to skip through some of this and look at the juicier text, verses 17 and 18. "These signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new languages. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and whatever poison they drink will not harm them. They will place their hands on the sick, and they will be well." Now, there's some people who take this to an extreme, and I think go beyond even what the interpretation of this text is. They're known as West Virginia snake handlers. And here you can see one group. I actually had some of my students go to one of these Appalachian churches and met with a pastor in his home. This was just a couple years ago. He said, "Do you really handle poisonous snakes?" And this guy is sitting in a rocking chair, and he pulls out from a box underneath his chair a rattlesnake. And if I were there, I would have passed out. I mean, I have a deathly fear of snakes. But here we have the snakes where they're handling them, and apparently one guy was not real lucky at one point. But then this guy is not lucky at all. That's all I want to show you. I won't show you more of those pictures. But Mark 16, I think the evidence points in one direction, that these 12 verses were added later. The earliest witnesses don't have it. It doesn't fit Mark's style of writing. No doctrinal issues are at stake because the resurrection of Jesus still occurs, just no resurrection appearances. And the material seems to be taken largely from the other Gospels and the book of Acts. Now, John 7:53 through 8:11 is the story of the woman caught in adultery, or its Latin name, the pericope adulterae, abbreviated the PA. It's my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. A distinction needs to be made between what is canonical and what is historical. By canonical, did the evangelist of the fourth gospel, whom we commonly call John, did he actually write this story, or was it added to his gospel later? If it was added to his gospel later, we would not consider it canonical. But did it actually happen historically? Bruce Metzger, Bart Ehrman's doctoral advisor at Princeton Seminary, said, "This passage has all the earmarks of historicity, even though John did not write it." And it may well be true historically, even if John did not write it. If it is not part of the New Testament, what do we lose, though? It's a great passage about Jesus forgiving an adulterous woman. The question I would have is this the only place we see where Jesus forgives somebody? If it is, then we would have a problem on our hands. But there are plenty of texts that speak of him forgiving people, and often of heinous sins. We don't have time to get into the argument, but the evidence against the authenticity of the PA is actually significantly stronger than the evidence against the authenticity of Mark 16:9 through 20. But most of you, at least you who are Christians, would say, "I'd far prefer to have the story of the woman caught in adultery in my New Testament than that longer ending, because then we could get rid of West Virginia, or at least the snake handlers in West Virginia." I don't want to be too politically incorrect. Sorry about that. If you're from West Virginia, I apologize. I'll tell my jokes more slowly from now on. Okay. Most Christians would prefer, as I said, to have the PA instead of the long ending to Mark in the Bibles, but faith must be based on evidence, not on emotion. And so that's something that I want to encourage those of you who are believers in Jesus Christ to do, is to get beyond the emotional issues and to have evidence for your faith. Question 3, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Well, again, we come back to Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code and Sir Lee Teabing. He declared to Sophie, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, immortal. He was referring to AD 325 when Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. He was there at the beginning, he came to the end, he wasn't there for most of it. But what Teabing is saying, what Dan Brown believes, and the book that he heavily borrowed from, we can't call it plagiarism because he won in the British court, but the book that he heavily borrowed from, the people who wrote that one also believed, is that Emperor Constantine invented the deity of Christ. In fact, that other book that Dan Brown is basing his work on, these scholars, well, I shouldn't call them scholars, they're novelists, but they essentially said there are no manuscripts prior to the 4th century, no Greek New Testament manuscripts before the 4th century. And so they believe that Emperor Constantine invented the deity of Christ. This is what M.M. al-Azami is trying to argue, that orthodoxy, which rose in the 4th century, invented the deity of Christ and demolished all other views. Remember how I told you an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption? Here's another ounce of evidence to look at. This is another papyrus, P66, written about AD 200, about 125 years before the Council of Nicaea. And this is John chapter 1. Read along with me if you would, in the first verse. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Just like all the rest of our New Testament say. 125 years before Constantine invented the deity of Christ, we have manuscripts of the New Testament that affirm the deity of Christ. Every single manuscript of John's Gospel, no matter the date or the language, says virtually the same thing in John 1:1. Jesus is unequivocally called God. And the same could be said for the major passages that affirm his deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, his bodily resurrection, and his second coming, just to name a few. So let's get to question 4. Question 4 is, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? I want to quote from Bart Ehrman, my friend, whom I've debated as was mentioned 3 times, and I want to quote from the appendix to his paperback version of Misquoting Jesus, page 252. The editors added an appendix to the paperback version so they could continue the sales going after the hardback had kind of run its course, and they wanted to keep the sales boosted up, and so they added this appendix. And in the appendix, they asked Dr. Ehrman, why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Notice what they're not saying. They're not saying, do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy? They are saying, why do you believe this? They wanted to get a soundbite of what was in the 250-page book. This is what Ehrman has to say. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Don't take my word for it. Take Bart Ehrman's. And many of you who have become so skeptical about the New Testament that you may have even lost your faith, abandoned the faith because it's too embarrassing to think that it goes back to the original, these copies that we have, you may well have misread what Dr. Ehrman is saying in his book. Here, he clearly states that essential Christian beliefs are not affected by these textual variants. I could not have said it more clearly, more accurately than Dr. Ehrman has. Thank you for your attention.